Okay, so for our next video in AUC section 230, we're going to be taking a look at the form, content, and extent of audit documentation. And the section is in AUC section 230.08 through 12. And so we'll be going through each of these in this video. So there's a lot of information here, and we see there's a lot of explanatory material. So we might be jumping around a bit to digest a piece and then move on to the next one. So let's first take a look at AUC section 230.08. And it says that the auditor should prepare audit documentation that's sufficient to enable an experienced auditor having no previous connection with the audit to understand the nature, timing, and extent of the audit procedures performed, the results of the audit procedures performed, and the significant findings or issues that arose during the audit. So basically, while we're documenting our work, we need to think in our heads, would someone who didn't know anything about the engagement, he knows about auditing and how that works, but he doesn't know anything about the engagement that we're working on, would he be able to come in and read our documentation or review the work that we did through our documentation, and would he be able to understand everything we did, the results of what we did, and any of the findings that came about? So let's go down to the explanatory material and see some more details about this. And we've got sections A4 through about 13 that touch on the details of how this works. So let's go down there. Okay, so now we're down in the explanatory material as it relates to the form, content, and extent of audit documentation. What we see here first off is it explains to us that the form, content, and extent of the audit documentation can depend on a number of factors. For instance, maybe a larger or more complex entity might require more extensive procedures. Maybe the nature of certain audit procedures would require the documentation to be in a different form or content. Also, maybe more risky audit areas or areas of more significance which require significant audit evidence might require more extensive audit documentation. Also, if we have some exceptions in our testing, or if there's something unusual here that we need to explain, this might be different content than maybe a section that didn't have exceptions or unusual circumstances. Also, different audit methodologies and tools might require a different form of audit evidence. For instance, if we used audit sampling in one case and we didn't sample in another case, and maybe areas that include or require a lot of judgment, maybe we have to explain a little bit more. And so the extent and content of our documentation is different than maybe another section that didn't require as much judgment. So moving along, we see here that QC section 10 establishes the archiving requirements of our audit documentation. And it says that we can have paper audit work papers, or we can have electronic. We just have to have established procedures for maintaining the integrity, accessibility, and retrievability of that documentation. And we have some examples here of different types of audit documentation. It might be our audit plans, different analysis. If we have memos that we wrote, summaries of significant findings, letters of confirmation and representation, different checklists, and correspondence, even emails regarding significant findings or issues. So all those things might be included in our audit documentation, either saved electronically or could be manually paper copies in some way. So what we don't need to include in the work papers are any superseded drafts of work papers, notes that reflect incomplete or preliminary thinking, previous copies of documents that we corrected later, or duplicates of documents. So basically, the audit documentation should include final versions of work papers. So nothing that was preliminary or that was just notes. They need to be finalized. So we need to have our audit documentation solid and in writing in some way, because oral explanations by the auditor don't represent adequate support for the work that we did. For instance, we might think that as the peer reviewer comes in, we could explain the work we did, but that's not satisfactory. We need to have the audit documentation set up in a way that a third-party person could come in and look at our work papers and understand what we did. Of course, we can explain orally or clarify the information that we have in the audit documentation, but we should make sure that we sufficiently document our work in our work papers. So next, we understand that we are documenting our work in order to be in compliance with GAAS. But in this next little section, it explains to us, how do we document our compliance with GAAS? Is it sufficient just to follow the rules of GAAS, or do we somehow need to document that we were in compliance with GAAS? So to answer that, we see here that compliance with the requirements of this section will result in the audit documentation being sufficient and appropriate in the circumstances. So we don't necessarily have to document how we complied with GAAS, but we do need to document our work in a way that is in compliance with this particular section, as well as all other AUC sections, and then that will be evidence of our compliance with GAAS. And we see that reiterated here, that our audit documentation provides evidence that the audit complies with GAAS. And it also makes note that there's no way that we could document every matter that we considered or professional judgment that we made. But in our professional judgment, we need to document appropriately, as we saw, for an experienced auditor to come in that is external to our engagement team, and they would be able to understand what we did. We also see here that it's not necessary for the auditor to document separately the compliance with matters for which the compliance is demonstrated by documents included with the audit file. So this means we don't necessarily have to, for instance, if we documented our work in a particular place, and then that means we don't have to, in another checklist, say that we documented our work there. So this saves us from double work. We have a few examples of that here. And firstly, the existence of an adequately documented audit plan demonstrates that the auditor has planned the audit. So we don't necessarily have to go through a checklist and make note or document that we planned the audit appropriately, because our audit documentation of the audit plan already proves that we did. That being said, it might be helpful to have such a checklist to make sure that we documented everything that we were supposed to in accordance with GAAS, but it's not necessary for our audit documentation. As another example, having a signed engagement letter in the audit file demonstrates that we agreed to the terms of the audit engagement with management, and so therefore we don't necessarily have to document or say that we obtained an engagement letter with management, because having that engagement letter proves that we did. And also throughout the GAAS, we have requirements that apply generally throughout the audit. And so rather than each time throughout the audit that we're complying with that particular section, rather than having to say that we demonstrated compliance in that piece each time, here's a few ways that we can document our compliance. The first example is professional skepticism. We're required to have professional skepticism throughout the audit, so it would really be impractical and inefficient to document every time we used our professional skepticism during the audit. Therefore, our audit documentation throughout the audit should support the notion that we did use professional skepticism. For instance, maybe we corroborate management's responses to certain information that we received, and that would be an example of the professional skepticism. But we didn't necessarily have to note that, hey, we used professional skepticism in this way. Another example is where the engagement partner is required to take responsibility for the direction, supervision, and performance of the audit, as we saw in the prior section. And that can be evidenced in a number of ways. For instance, documentation in the audit file might include the engagement partner's involvement with different aspects of the audit. For instance, his participation in the team discussions is required in Section 315. So to sum this up, we don't necessarily have to document or say that we complied with certain AUC sections, but our documentation should imply that we did comply with the AUC sections. So going down here, we have some more documentation requirements, and this is related to the documentation of significant findings or issues and related significant professional judgments. So if, as going through our audit, we have a lot of misstatements or other issues that are significant to us, then there are certain requirements of us in our documentation. And so these findings and issues require an objective analysis of the facts and circumstances. And some examples of significant findings or issues might be matters that involve the selection, application, and consistency of significant accounting practices, including related disclosures. And so that might be the accounting for complex transactions, complex estimates, and uncertainties. Some examples of significant findings or issues might also be matters that give rise to significant risk, which we'll see in AUC Section 315. Some other significant findings might be the results of audit procedures that indicate the financial statements could be materially misstated, or a need to revise the auditor's previous assessment of the risk of material misstatement. So as we're going through the audit and our procedures, we find a misstatement, or we decide that we need to alter our risk assessment. Maybe we found a more risky place in the audit, or that we need to explore deeper. So we need to document those findings. Also, if we have some circumstances that cause the auditor significant difficulty in applying necessary audit procedures, we should document that judgment that we use to apply different audit procedures and to get comfortable over these circumstances. And also, if we've got a modification to the audit opinion, or have to put in an emphasis of a matter paragraph, then we need to document our judgment around that as well. So basically, all these things are results from our testing where it's something unusual or that has required us to use a significant amount of professional judgment. And as a result, we need to document it extensively so someone outside of the audit could come in and understand the judgments that we used in coming to the conclusions and getting comfortable with each of these items. So going down a little bit farther, we reiterate that the important factor in determining the form, content, and extent of audit documentation of the significant findings, as we saw the examples up here, is the professional judgments that we made. And this serves to explain the auditor's conclusions and to reinforce the quality of the judgment. And it allows someone to come in and review the audit documentation and understand our findings and why we came to those conclusions. It also makes it easy to carry forward the audit engagement to subsequent engagements. And allows the next year's auditors to understand what happened and maybe to rely on some of the evidence that we obtained this year. For instance, maybe when they're doing a retrospective review of accounting estimates. And some other examples of circumstances when we would want to prepare audit documentation related to our exercise of professional judgment include the rationale for the auditor's conclusion, when a requirement provides that the auditor should consider certain information or factors, and the basis for the auditor's conclusion on the reasonableness of areas of subjective judgments, for instance, significant accounting estimates. Next, we should prepare audit documentation related to our judgments when the basis for the auditor's conclusions about the authenticity of a document required further investigation. So maybe we got a document that we weren't sure if it was authentic or if it had been fraudulently modified. Then we need to document our further investigation of that. So in general, anything that requires us to have extensive professional judgment requires us to document well our understanding and our conclusions and how we came to those conclusions. Therefore, some things in the audit would be straightforward, cut and dry. This number equals that number. But there are certain areas of the audit that require our significant professional judgment, and we need to make sure that we document those appropriately. And finally, at A13, it gives some more tips on preparing documentation related to our findings. And they suggest doing a completion memorandum that describes the work that was done and the significant findings or issues identified during audit and how they were addressed, and then cross-references to other supporting audit documentation to support the summary. And so this would facilitate an effective and efficient review and also allow a peer reviewer to come in and see what all was done in the audit. And it also allows the auditor to kind of take a step back and look at the significant findings and what happened in the audit and determine if the conclusions reached were appropriate. So typically in our audits, we'll have a completion memorandum, and it includes some analytics of the accounts and explains the change and whether we think that the balance this year is appropriate based on those analytics, and also provides an explanation of the testing that we did around the different accounts and audit areas, and then any significant findings that we found. So those things help someone that comes into the audit to read that completion document, almost start there, and then they can understand where they want to dig deeper if they want to understand another piece of the audit. But also it serves as a way for us to understand the reasonableness of the account balances based on just looking at the balances based on our analytics and what we know about the company, as well as the testing that we performed. And then we can see are the conclusions that we reached, do they seem reasonable as well? So this completion document is very helpful in summing up what was performed in the engagement.